Hi there, and welcome to Chapter 9 of Business and Finance. So Chapter 9 is all about the professional accountant. Now, I will warn you in advance, this is a pretty dry chapter, and essentially it's just lots of little bits and pieces that you need to memorize for the exam. So unfortunately, not much of a story to tell. We will have a look at a few accounting principles, but again, these are mainly things that you should have covered already in your study. So hopefully, a relatively straightforward chapter, if one that you need to make perhaps a bit of a list of facts to remember. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do, as always, is to define what we're going to talk about. So this chapter is all about the professional accountant, so it makes sense for us to start there. So we're going to start off by talking about what we mean by professional in the context of this exam, also what we mean by accountancy, and then thinking about this accountancy profession. So by professional, relatively straightforward, we're talking about somebody who professes to have skills. So have skills from a coherent course of study and training based on professional values, and who continues to develop. So it's not just that I've done these exams and now I'm finished forever. You have to be able to show that you've developed your skills going forward. Accountancy, we're just talking about, well, anyone who works in accounting. So measurement, preparation, validation, disclosure, auditing of, and provision of assurance and advisory services, all to do with that financial information. So a wide range of jobs can be included in that term. By accountancy profession, then we're essentially putting those two things together. So we're saying, well, if professional means anyone who professes to have skills based on studying, based on continuing development, and accountancy is all about measuring, preparing assurance and advisory services on financial information, then put those two things together and we've got somebody who works in that role. So profession concerned with all of those things we've just seen: measurement, disclosure, provision of assurance, and anybody who provides information that helps essentially any of those stakeholders that we've seen. Okay. Now, because the kind of core theme running through those definitions then is all to do with providing good information and giving a level of assurance, we've just broken that down in a bit more detail here. So by financial reporting, a bit of a recap on what we've already seen: provision of financial information about an entity to external users that is useful for them making economic decisions. Assurance then is all about an opinion. We're trying to express an opinion that is designed to enhance confidence of intended users. So for an external audit, for example, you'd be giving an opinion on the whether the financial statements show a true and fair view, and that's all about trying to enhance the confidence primarily of shareholders. Okay, now one thing that can't be underestimated is how important the accountancy profession is. And really we're going to look at that from 2 points of view. So we're going to say, well, firstly, think about those capital markets that we discussed in the last chapter. And we're going to consider why it's so important that the accountancy profession is there. And also we think about public interest. Okay, so let's think about what we know about the capital markets already. Well, we know that the capital markets are vital for a business to fund their capital structure. So if we're going out and borrowing money or selling shares, for example. Now these places are where somebody or businesses or people who have too much money will go and invest their money, and people who don't have enough money will go and borrow money. Now if you consider how that works, we have to find a way of almost pricing these borrowings or investing. So what interest rate and so on. Now that only works if you can truly trust the information that's been provided about the investment. So for example, if I were to invest in a business, if I were to buy some corporate bonds from a business, I would need to take the information about that business, about their plans, at face value. Otherwise I'd be unable to put any sort of confidence in the investment. So I would need to know what the level of risk I'm facing is in order to know what return I require. And that's why the accounting profession is so important, because the accounting profession, all the accounting standards, the fact that lots of businesses require their accounts to be audited, that gives me the confidence to actually go out and make an investment. The idea that we don't have good enough information. It feeds into this kind of asymmetric information. So some people have all of the information and some people don't. So for example, the business would have all of the information and the person trying to buy the investment wouldn't. So if they haven't been upfront and honest, we can't rely on the information provided, then that will put the investor at a disadvantage. Now the key to that would be, or the result from that would be, nobody would want to buy any investments. Okay, so nobody would be making any investments, and therefore no business would be able to go to the market and actually borrow money. The role that the professional accountant has then is that they make sure that all our financial reporting is good enough. So it's high quality, it's accurate, and this means that the capital market carries on to work effectively. So really, really important. The public interest section here then just refers to the fact that it's not just investors that we're going to need to worry about. So obviously the capital markets refer mainly to investors and borrowers, but the public interest is going to be everybody else. So for example, you as an employee, you're going to need to rely on information at some point. The government's going to have to rely on information. Other clients, other customers are going to have to. So it's really, really important that all of that reporting, all of the reporting information to their stakeholders is really good. So again, it's all about confidence, and you need to make sure that the level of expertise and integrity is high enough. So what are all those stakeholders looking for? High quality reports that inform us as stakeholders. So whether that's as an employee, whether that's as a supplier, that they're relevant, that they're transparent, and that they're free of material misstatements. Again, if you think about external audit, this is what external audit is all about, trying to make sure that our financial statements are free from material misstatements in order to rely on them. Section 2 here then goes on to talk in a bit more detail about how an accountant has to behave in terms of ethics, and we're going to come on and see that in the next section. So section 3 then, thinking about that professional responsibility, we start off with an interactive question. So as always, we'll have a quick read through the question. So why is it important for an accountant to uphold ethical standards and behave ethically? So what I want you to do is pause the recording, just jot down a few ideas. You don't have to go crazy with it, just to get ourselves thinking about what we mean by ethics, why it's important for us. So if you can pause now, have a think, and then we'll come back together and have a chat. Okay, so hopefully you've got some ideas there. I guess the first thing we need to consider really is what we mean by ethics. So what is ethical behaviour? I think the easiest definition would be just thinking about like an acceptable system of behaviour. We'll come on to the actual ICAEW principles a bit later. Okay, so we know what we mean by ethics, and let's think of why it's so important then for an accountant to have ethical standards. The obvious or the easy answer is to kind of hark back to what we've just seen. So it's really important to protect public interest. You can also think about, well, it's likely that lots of ethical issues are going to be kind of driven by law and regulation, so we need to make sure we're in line with those different laws in order to ensure correct behaviour. And I guess overall, it's in everybody's interest, every accountant's interest, if we're trying to uphold accountancy profession's reputation. So again, don't worry if you haven't got exactly, oops, too many F's there. Don't worry if you haven't got exactly those points written down. I'm sure what you've got is good. There are some extra answers at the back of the notes there in chapter 15. So again, just have a look through those and make sure that what you've got is kind of vaguely in the right area. Okay, so over the page, we start to think about the different types of ethical approaches. So we've got two approaches here. We've got the compliance-based approach to ethics and the ethics-based approach. Now actually the ethics-based approach we most commonly call the principles-based approach, and it's nice and easy to remember the compliance-based approach as the rules-based approach. So rules versus principles. So over on the left here with the rules or compliance-based approach, which we see in the US, The ethical guidelines will be rules. So they will think of every possible ethical situation, and they will say, this is what you have to do in that situation. Now that's obviously good because there's no grey area. The problem with that approach, though, is what if there's not a rule for it? It means I can do whatever I want. So that's going to be difficult. Over on the other side, then, it's almost a more kind of, I guess you could perhaps think of it more as a kind of a grown-ups approach, or an approach that gives you a bit more kind of credibility. So with an ethics or principles-based approach, there's no specific rules. Okay, so generally we just think about, well, how would we expect an accountant to behave, and they'll give general guidelines then. Okay, so it tells you how you should behave rather than what you should do. So the problem with this would be a bit more of a grey area, but the advantage is that you can't get away with saying, well, there's not a specific rule for this, so I just did whatever I wanted to. The ICAW uses the ethics or principle-based approach, and we're going to have a look at the fundamental principles of integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality and professional behaviour in the next recording, which is obviously just going to be the second recording from chapter 9. Okay. Only other thing I want us to have a quick chat about before we move on to the next recording is regulation. Okay. Now again, we're going to deal with this in a bit more detail in later recordings, but this table is just a nice overview of what ICAW has to do. So the ICAW will perform certain tasks or certain requirements for its members, and that will kind of enable them to kind of ensure different areas. So for example, we've got there's going to be rigorous entry and education requirements to become a member of the ICAW. There's extra requirements if you work in some of those protected areas. Also, if you work in public practice, you have to have indemnity assurance, and the idea is that these things will ensure technical competence. The next group of requirements then are really to do with regulation. We're going to come back to those in chapter 10, but they do have an oversight regulation by the FRC, which we'll look into, and there's also a rigorous complaints procedure, so we'll look through that procedure as well. Okay, so that's all for sections 1 to 3 then. In the next recording, we'll pick up the rest of chapter 9, where we'll start considering technical competence. Like I said, we'll have a look at those 5 principles in terms of ethics, and we also need to make sure we've dealt with the various accounting principles that you need to know, which I imagine you've seen before. Okay, thanks a lot. Grab a cup of tea, and then we'll come back together for the second half of chapter 9.